Welcome to the opening program for Keeping History Above Water, Nantucket. My name is Michael May. I am the Executive Director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust. The Nantucket Preservation Trust is a nonprofit membership organization that advocates for the protection and preservation of the island's historic resources, including its architectural heritage, streetscapes, historic landscapes, and of course the island's unique sense of place. Sea level rise has and will continue to have an impact on our historic buildings and infrastructure. How we plan, adapt, and protect Nantucket is really at the heart of this two-day conference. This issue is one that will take a lot of work and many difficult decisions. Our goal in helping to develop this project is to engage the community, to learn from others in the Commonwealth and across the country, and to listen and consider options as we plan future strategies. And NPT is committed to documenting the island's historic resources to ensure that the history of Nantucket's built environment endures. NPT is extremely happy to co-sponsor Keeping History Above Water in Nantucket with our preservation partner on island, the University of Florida's Preservation Institute Nantucket, the town of Nantucket, the Newport Restoration Foundation that actually began the Keeping History Above Water programs, and Remain Nantucket. We are very grateful for the community support we received from our members and local businesses who helped to really make this conference possible. And the partners are especially appreciative for the grant funding from the Massachusetts Office of Coastal Zone Management, the Osceola Foundation, the Community Foundation for Nantucket's Remain Nantucket Fund, and many other private individuals. I will now turn the program over to Marty Hilton, who is the director of the Preservation Institute Nantucket from the University of Florida. He will introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Before I introduce Jeff, I just wanted to take this opportunity. There may be people here who didn't realize University of Florida was on Nantucket and are thinking, what the hell is going on? So this is actually the 50th consecutive year of the Gator Nation invading Nantucket in the summer. We are the oldest continually operating hands-on program for historic preservation in the country. Officially founded in 1972, we have about 3 more years before the 50th anniversary. By the way, I turned 48 this year, so 50 is not such a big deal anymore to me. But we have, as Walter Beinecke Jr., who helped create the program, said, we're one of the island's best kept secrets. But we have now had 750 people from all over the country and the world go through the program. They've gone on to become leaders in historic preservation, both nationally and globally. So Nantucket, just like it did during the whaling era, continues to have an immense reach when it comes to cultural heritage conservation. And we are very pleased over the last 3-5 years to partner very closely with Michael May and the staff of the Nantucket Preservation Trust. We even live together now at 11 Center Street, Sherburne Hall, so come visit us. So with that said, I will introduce our speaker. Jeff Goodell's most recent book, The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World, was a New York Times Critics' Top Book of 2017. As well as one of the Washington Post 50 notable works of nonfiction the same year. He's the author of 5 previous books, including Big Coal, The Dirty Secret Behind America's Energy Future, and How to Cool the Planet, Co-Engineering and the Audacious Quest to Fix Earth's Climate. He is a contributing editor at Rolling Stone and a frequent contributor to the New York Times Magazine. As a commentator on energy and climate issues, he has appeared on NPR, MSNBC, CNN, CNBC, ABC, NBC, Fox News, and even on the Oprah Winfrey Show. So with that, thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Marty. Everybody loves it. I'll never forget the Oprah Winfrey Show. That was the highlight of my career. I'm incredibly honored to be here to open this conference. It's really great. I've given a lot of talks around the world about this book and about sea level rise, but I don't know that I've ever been in quite as beautiful a building as this. And I've certainly never had organ music. I was a little disappointed we didn't do Phantom of the Opera thing as we started out, but I want to thank the Nantucket Preservation Trust, University of Florida, Town of Nantucket, Remain Nantucket, and all the other sponsors who have helped put this together. I especially wanted to thank Marty for all his work and Lisa Craig for all her work in putting this together. I want to talk a little bit about my book, about what I've learned, give you a kind of broad overview about this issue of sea level rise and what the world faces, talk a little bit about what I learned in this book. I'll talk a little bit in detail about Nantucket, but I'm really looking at a kind of big picture, and the rest of the conference will fill in a lot of the more local things, although I'm happy to talk about it in questions afterwards. I want to say two things before I start. One is the first question I always get as soon as the talk ends is, do you have any hope? And I will tell you right now that I do have hope, and I will explain exactly what kind of hope I have at the end. The other thing I want to tell you is just a tiny bit about who I am, just so you know how I'm coming at this. I have 3 kids. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I worked at a little company at the time with this guy running around barefoot and yelling Bob Dylan lyrics at his little company called Apple that I thought was going nowhere. Turned out to be a kind of successful place. I brilliantly left Apple right before the stock went public and became a journalist. I've been a journalist for 30 years. The last 20 years has been covering climate change from every potential angle: energy, energy systems, politics, and of course climate impacts. I wrote a book about the coal industry. I wrote a book about geoengineering, which is large-scale manipulation of the Earth's climate, which we can get into later if you have questions, if you want to have any questions about that. And then this book, The Water Will Come, which is about sea level rise. I just want to tell you just a tiny bit about how I started this book. I have been writing about climate change for a very long time. Never really thought about sea level rise as anything, other than I knew about it, but I thought it was sort of this long, slow curve of change that would be incremental and, we could all deal with in the way. There was always other priorities for me of what to write about with climate. And then Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. I saw 9 feet of water come into the Lower East Side of Manhattan. I wasn't there that day, but I was there the next day. Saw what water can do to a big city, and I was thinking about how to write about this as a journalist, how to cover this, and I was talking to a scientist at Columbia, and he said, well, one way to think about what happened in New York with Hurricane Sandy is a kind of dress rehearsal for sea level rise. And I was like, well, what do you mean? He said, well, imagine that 9 feet of water that came in just stayed in and didn't go out in a couple of hours. 9 feet is what, at the time, some of the highest level projections were for the end of the century. And he said, that's sort of what it would look like. And that kind of blew my mind. But he said, you really want to blow your mind, go have that same thought experiment in Miami. And I was like, why? And he said, just go and you'll see. So I went and I saw, and on a sunny day with high tides, I saw 2 and 3 feet of water in Miami Beach. And I was there about 24 hours, and I figured out that for anyone who takes climate change seriously, Miami has a very, very troubled future. It was not a hard thing to realize. You have a very flat, all of South Florida is very flat. You have a lot of real estate right on the beach, and it's built on Swiss cheese. It's built on a kind of porous limestone that makes it impossible basically to build seawalls because the water will go right underneath. So I wrote a story for Rolling Stone with a very subtle title called Goodbye Miami. it caused a little bit of a ruckus. I tell my kids that if there's ever a kind of Karen Silkwood moment in my life where I'm in a car with the brake lines cut, and the first person they should go to is the Miami Real Estate Association, because they were not thrilled with this piece that I wrote. But it really opened my eyes to the risks of sea level rise and to what cities and coastlines around the world face. And that's when this book began. So I decided I was going to take what I saw in Miami and see what other cities around the world were doing. So I began traveling around the world and reporting this book. I spent 4 years doing it. I went to Greenland, of course, because when you think about sea level rise, and the real issue is what's happening on the two big things at the top and bottom of the world, in Greenland and Antarctica. All the other stuff, thermal expansion of the water, mountain glaciers, all this kind of stuff is inconsequential, really. It's what's happening at the two poles that is really important. I went to Lagos, spent some time in the water slums there. I learned a very important lesson there, which is that one of the big problems with the sort of risks of sea level rise is that we've built our world in the West with the idea that the water is here and the land is here and forever it shall be the same. So we've built a lot of stuff basically that we can't move easily. Whereas in the water slums, you talk to the people in Lagos about 4 feet of sea level rise, 6 feet of sea level rise, they're like, yeah, no problem, tomorrow, I can have it fixed. I can raise their places in no time. And it really made me understand this issue of all this sort of permanent fixed infrastructure that we have. I went to the Marshall Islands, where sea level rise is not just a question of real estate values or dislocation or eroding beaches, but an actual existential crisis where you have a potential extinction of a country and a culture. And people thinking there about what happens does the Marshall Islands exist if it goes underwater? Where do I go? What do we do? What happens to our culture? What happens to our fishing rights? What happens to everything? I went to Venice, where everyone knows has been the poster child for sinking cities. They've stabilized the sinking, but they still have the problem of the water rising. I was sitting as soon as I got to Venice, I'd been there several times before, but when I went there with the lens of sea level rise and flooding, I immediately thought, this is how all cities should be. Water cities are so great. Why didn't we build all cities this way? But then I got into Piazza San Marco, was there a couple minutes drinking my espresso, and water came rushing into Piazza San Marco, literally while I was there, just high tide flooding covering Piazza San Marco. They bring the duck boards out, people keep going, but you can feel the water rising in a very real way on high tides in Venice. And Venice is the poster child for the difficulty of preserving places that have great architectural value. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute, but that was part of my journey. I went and traveled around Alaska for a few days with this guy. It's sort of surreal, thinking about spending 3 days talking with the President of the United States in a kind of articulate way about climate change, and thinking back on it now, it's hard to kind of imagine. But it's not as surreal as the idea of having that same conversation with our current president. That would be, that would be even more surreal. So I want to distill everything that I learned just to a couple of points that I think are really important to grasp, that I think are the kind of takeaway lessons of what I learned during those 4 years, and I think might be useful to you in thinking about sea level rise and what's going to be happening here in Nantucket. The first thing is that my book is called The Water Will Come. It's not called The Water Will Come unless we all put solar panels on our houses. Or it's not called The Water Will Come unless we sell our SUVs and ride skateboards to work. The point that is really important to grasp about this idea of sea level rise is that no matter what we do with carbon emissions, cutting carbon emissions, which is incredibly important, not suggesting that it's not, but because of the way the oceans have absorbed the heat that's already built up, we are going to have significant amounts of sea level rise no matter what we do. So the fantasy that we're going to get our act together, cut emissions, and stop all this is just not true. We can we can affect the trajectory of it, the ultimate height of it, but it's going to happen. Most scientists, there's a range, but will tell you that we have between 10 and 30 feet of sea level rise baked in right now. Okay? And that is if we stopped all carbon now, which we of course are not going to do. Question is the time scale of this. Is it going to happen in decades, in centuries? What is the time scale for this? And that's the big question. When we think about water, it's really important also, I kind of didn't get this, but the amount of water on the planet is fixed, right? Elon Musk is not inventing more water or anything like that. The amount is fixed, and it gets redistributed around the planet depending on the temperatures, right? So when it's particularly cold, you have ice sheets growing and sea levels falling. When it's particularly warm, the ice sheets melt, the sea levels rise, right? And this has been happening for a very long time on the planet. This is the last major ice age, which covered the continent of North America here from about 30,000 years ago till about 10,000 years ago. And coincidentally is the reason why we're all sitting out here right now. Antarctica was formed by the terminal moraine, basically the gravel and dirt pushed by the glacier. That's what we're standing on right now. It's a big pile of gravel and dirt created by the front of this glacier. That glacier has, of course, gone away now. And one of the things that we're seeing is that we've had this relative stability for the since those glaciers melted about 8 or 9,000 years ago. And now the sea level is starting to rise more quickly. It only rose about 6 inches in the 20th century. You think, what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that is changing fast. And I want to show you I'd like to show people this just so you have a very clear and visceral sense of how our planet is warming. This is real time. This is real temperature measures. The dark, obviously the yellow and the orange are above normal temperatures, above the median temperatures, and the blue are cooler. And this is just going to run through in like 30 seconds from 1880 till today. And it'll just gives you a real good sense of what's happening in our world. And you can see in the late 19th century, things were pretty stable, moves along, everything's looking more or less stable through the early part of the 20th century. Starting to see a little bit of warming going on, keep your eye especially in the far north. And you're starting to see more up all the way to the 1950s now. It's still, not that different, but look what starts to happen. And this is our world today. Okay, and what's important about this is not just obviously the warming, but where the warming is. A lot of it is up in the north, where, as all of you know, there's a lot of ice. The Arctic Circle, Greenland, all of that. And so for reasons that I don't need to go into right now, that's where a lot of the warming is happening most strongly. And so it's melting the ice. The question of how much sea level rise we're going to see is really key. Everyone wants to know that. All the engineers always want to ask me and other scientists, if you could just give us a number, we could design easily what we need. So please tell us. But of course, there is no number. We don't know. But we do know that right now, NOAA, the top science agency in the United States, has a range of about 2 feet to about 8 feet by the end of the century. It's important to know that it's not going to stop then. That's just a kind of convenient measuring point, just to give you a kind of point of reference. But that partly depends on a lot of factors, our emissions, climate sensitivity, and all that kind of thing. But the other thing that's really important to know is that the error bars are getting bigger and bigger. The boundaries are getting higher and higher. 10 years ago, most of the high-end estimates were 4 to 5 feet. Now it's 8 feet. And the best ice scientist in the world, arguably, a guy named Richard Alley at Penn State University, told me a few months ago that he can't rule out 15 feet by the end of the century. And the reason, I want to talk about the reason why these things are getting, these levels are getting higher. But first I want to show you this is what 7 feet means to a place like Miami, which is where I did a lot of work. You can see with 7 feet, it's not only Miami Beach that goes away, but the water starts coming in from the Everglades also, and you get a lot of flooding in the western part of Miami-Dade County, including the golf course where our president had a $200,000 plate fundraiser the other day, Doral, is completely underwater. The airport, notice, is also in big trouble. So you can see how devastating 7 feet would be to a place like Miami. I'm not going to show you a lot about Nantucket because this is something that's going to, Marty and others have lots of great information about that we will see in the next, in the following days with the conference. But just to give you a little bit of a sense, this is it's called a bathtub model. It's just a basic elevation and flooding thing. This just to give you a feeling for it. So this is right now, the historic downtown, and this is just 3 feet of water. And you're already getting significant flooding in this entire area here. And then if you go to 6 feet, which isn't even the high end at all, it's all under, right? So this is what we're talking about when we talk about these numbers and the impacts of them. This just gives you a sort of sense of what we're facing. But the reason that these numbers are getting higher have to do with a place called Antarctica. I just got back from Antarctica. I still have sort of sea legs. I was on a ship for 2.5 months where we were reporting or investigating. I was with a British Antarctic Survey and the National Science Foundation on what they called an emergency research trip to look at a couple of big glaciers in West Antarctica and to see what's going on. Up until about 10 years ago, scientists knew, of course, all about the risks of the potential of melting in Greenland. There was a lot of focus on that. But they thought Antarctica was pretty stable. It's a big, big, big continent, the size of the United States and Mexico. If it all melted, which it's not going to do in any time in even hundreds of years, it holds enough ice there for 230 feet of sea level rise in the entire continent. Greenland only holds about 22 feet, so it gives you a sense of how much more ice there is in Antarctica. But scientists thought that it was pretty stable, and because they would fly satellites over it and things, and there was no surface melt as there is in Greenland. But then they realized that something else is going on, and that something else is what I was down there to investigate with these scientists, and that's in fact the ship I was on. This is a picture taken by a drone that we launched from the ship. It was an incredible adventure being down there for 2.5 months with these great scientists. But I want to tell you a little bit about what they were concerned about and why these sea level rise numbers are going higher and why there's increasing concern about the speed of what's happening in our world. So this is Antarctica. We went to a place called Thwaites Glacier, which is down here in West Antarctica, very remote. We were the first people who had ever been actually to the front of this glacier. There was no mapping, there was nothing. The seabed was completely unmapped. It was a very kind of pioneering trip. But here's what we were looking at, what they were concerned about. And that is the way that these glaciers can collapse. In Greenland, it's about a kind of surface melting. It's kind of ice cube on a picnic table kind of thing. How fast does that take, to melt on a hot day? In Antarctica, it's something entirely different is going on. And what I want to show you is that, to talk about it's important here, is this idea of these glaciers. The one with the Thwaites Glacier is about the size of Idaho. It's on what's called a reverse slope bed, so the back of the bed goes downward like that, you can see. And the glacier meets the ocean at what's called the grounding line there. So what's happening is as the water gets a little bit warmer, only 1 degree, not even a full degree, it's beginning to melt at that grounding line. The ice shelves are collapsing, and the water is getting under the glaciers. This warmer water is getting under the glaciers. And consequences of that is that these glaciers begin to fracture from being sort of unsupported underneath. And there's a phenomenon called marine ice cliff instability that means that any ice cliff over 100 meters, and some of these would be 2 miles high at their highest point, will just collapse on their own. And you get a phenomenon like this, which is basically like dumping a lot of ice cubes into a glass really fast, is what we're talking about. And when you have a bunch of ice cubes that are 2 miles thick and the size of Idaho, that's a lot of water. And so this is why, basically, in a nutshell, these numbers and these risks of sea level rise are getting higher and higher because of what's happening in Antarctica and because of this. And I saw this in real time. I think I have a pointer here. This is where our ship was on March 2nd, that red dot, right? This is Thwaites Glacier all in here, this whole thing. We were cruising along there, doing our studies, looking at ocean currents and things like that. 4 days later, satellite photo, we're here. Look at this, this entire thing has collapsed, right? This is an area 40 miles by 25 miles of ice went into the ocean in real time while we were there. This was like, on one morning we wake up and there's like, why are all these giant icebergs all around us? It was like, I don't mean giant in the sense of like big, I mean giant in the sense of the size of Nantucket icebergs floating all around us. And this is what was happening. So this is not some sort of scientific sort of modeling scenario. This is happening in real time. The question is, how fast will it happen? You know, are there natural stopping points and all that kind of thing? But this is, in a nutshell, you know, why scientists are kind of freaking out a little bit about thinking about sea level rise rates, okay? Okay, the second point I want to make is the really important is the trouble begins long before a city becomes the new Atlantis, right? It's not, wait, oh, there's sharks swimming through the lobby of the Hilton now, we're in trouble. You know, as you know here, even modest amounts of flooding cause a lot of problems, right? So one of the things that starts to happen, the way sea level rise manifests itself, is increased flooding in a daily, weekly, monthly kind of ways. The high tides just get higher and higher. The once in 100-year floods come more often. We're seeing that already along lots of places in the US along the coast. When you look at Nantucket, the projections by 2040 is 5 times more significant flooding each month, just by 2040. So this is the sort of narrative storyline for sea level rise, is increase high tide flooding more and more and more and more until it keeps pushing higher and higher. A second thing that even modest amounts of sea level rise cause problems with, as many of you may know here, is salt water begins getting into the drinking water aquifer. You have a freshwater lens of water here on the island, and in many places this is also happening in South Florida, happening in the Marshall Islands, happening in many places. The salt water begins pushing in underneath and getting into these drinking water wells. And that's a big problem. It doesn't take very much salt water in a drinking water well to make it undrinkable. And so what do? You have to move your well. And so, for example, in South Florida, they're moving the wells back and back and back, but now they're running into the Everglades and they can't move them back anymore. So that's a big problem. Here on Nantucket, you have ability to move things around some, but eventually these aquifers are going to get more and more salt water in them. And so then you have questions of, okay, where's the fresh water going to come from? Are we going to do desalinization? What's the scenario? Are we going to be importing water? What are we going to do? But this happens long before the sharks arrive. The other thing that you're a little bit familiar with here is the problem of sewage. This is especially a problem in any place that still has septic tanks. Even modest amounts of flooding, of course, really are a problem on anyone on a septic system. But there's also a problem for municipal sewage systems, because any leaks or anything like that you have in the system, and they all have leaks, begin to distribute, shall we say, the unpleasant stuff in ways that you will not be happy about. And so this is a big problem already in many places, even before the water is sort of running into your living room. The other, of course, huge issue is real estate values. We're already starting to see a change in real estate values in coastal areas. I gave a book talk in the mountains of North Carolina not too long ago when I was on my book tour, and like 400 people showed up. And I was like, what are you all doing here? Why are you here? It's a good book, but I mean, why are you all here? And it turned out that most of them had left their places on the Outer Banks and moved into the mountains to get away from sea level rise, and they wanted to sell their places while their values were still high. There's a lot of this beginning to go on. And it's a particular problem because, of course, real estate values have a big connection to tax revenues, of course, as you know. So you get a decline in tax revenues in a lot of coastal areas at exactly the moment when communities need to start spending more money for protection, infrastructure, storm drainage systems, sewage, seawalls. All of this coastal adaptation stuff that you hear a lot about and think about a lot of it is doable in different kinds of ways, but it's all expensive. And so the question becomes, where does the money come from for a lot of communities if you have a declining tax revenue and increasing expenses? And it's a kind of vicious cycle that is worrying a lot of people that I know who are in city councils and other communities along the coast. And of course, eventually you get people just saying, hell, but I'm moving away. I don't want to pay X% more on taxes for coastal infrastructure or whatever. I don't want to lose half the value of my house. You know, they begin to think about, well, you know, my house is worth a certain amount. Is it going to be worth the same amount in 15 years? Can I take that risk? Do I want to be here? Banks are already beginning to think about, you know, are we going to be giving mortgages on houses for 30 years when in 30 years it might be worth half as much? Credit ratings for communities start to go up higher if they don't see you doing really strong adaptation stuff. There's a lot of financial implications to this that are already beginning to really bite and bite hard, and that's just going to accelerate. And then, of course, you have the whole problem of displaced people on the move and where they're going to be relocating and all of that. I don't need to go into a whole lot of that right now. But I do want to talk about this idea of adaptation and preservation, because it's very clear to me from my time traveling around the world that billions of dollars are going to be spent on this. And there's going to be all kinds of adaptation ideas, and people are going to try all kinds of good, interesting things. Some of it will be well spent, but a lot of it will not. There's a lot of dumb ideas out there, dumb projects that people are dumping a lot of money into. So, I mean, just to go through some of the things that I've been seeing and that are better and worse kind of ideas. One are these sort of living breakwater ideas. This is off the coast of New Jersey, where they're basically building breakwaters that have a lot of ecological benefits and things like that. They don't really help with sea level rise per se, but they can help with storm surges and things like that. And they're an increasingly popular ideas in some places. And before I go into more of these solutions, I want to say that it's really one of the hard things to grasp for me about this is that every place is different. So like, you hear a lot about what the Dutch are doing. Well, the Dutch have incredible engineering experience. They've been dealing with water for 1,000 years. 60-70% of the country is below sea level. But what works in the Netherlands doesn't necessarily work in Nantucket or in Miami or in Lagos. And what works in Lagos doesn't necessarily work in Nantucket because the geology is different, the coastal conditions are different, the sociology of the place is different, the culture of the place is different. So one of the hard things about thinking about adaptation is figuring out what works for where you are. Miami Beach is doing this, has spent a couple $100 million on increasing storm drainage and pumping, putting in a lot of big pumps all around Miami Beach. It's helped a lot, except then the pumps fail and flooding happens anyway, and people are getting upset about the money and the increasing taxes. They're upset that the streets are torn up. You know, there's about a 20-block area where they're experimenting with elevating sidewalks and buildings. That's working to some degree, but then people are unhappy about that because it makes the neighborhood feel like a kind of tilt-a-whirl thing where it's like everything's on different levels. And there's a lot of problems with that also, but the drainage thing has is really helped, and it's certainly bought Miami Beach some time. It's not a solution in any big way, but it has helped in some of the worst flooding areas. You're starting to see a lot of communities moving towards higher ground, just deciding when we redevelop, we're developing in higher places, and we're slowly going to kind of migrate upwards, the way you might do with your towel on the beach as the tide goes up. You just pick it up, move it a little higher, and then the tide comes and hit your feet, and so you move it a little higher. And that's basically the strategy that a lot of cities are beginning to adapt in thinking about how they're going to plan for this. And that, you know, obviously can work well as long as it happens at the kind of right kind of rate, and that it really does happen and all that. It's a very common sense kind of solution. There's also the idea of raising buildings, of course. You can raise anything. This is a picture of a hotel in Chicago in 1870, I think. The Tremont Hotel. It was a 240-room brick hotel that they raised 8 feet, just with like 1,000 guys with wood corkscrews, just like moving it a little bit the hotel didn't even close. There's stories about people having tea as the giant hotel went up. So, I mean, you can raise anything, right? That's not a problem. The problem is, you know, can you raise everything, and what happens to the community around you? You know, there's things like this. This person's going to be okay, right? But do you want to be up in your house like that, and then everybody else is down below with like malaria in their living room, and you know, swamps, and you can't get to your house. You need a jet ski to get to your house, and you know. So the idea of I'm just going to save myself is very problematic. You need the reason people live in communities like Nantucket or on the Jersey Shore is the entire community. And so the question is, what is the community doing, and how does the community respond to this more than just can I save myself? There's of course seawalls. You may recognize this place. Seawalls have their place, but they're also very problematic for many reasons, which many of you may know about. I won't go and spend a lot of time with them, but they're, you know, an ecological nightmare. They kill all coastal life, basically. They can fail or be breached, as we learned in New Orleans, and you've learned here, I think, in some of your flooding. And there's also the social justice issue, which is like who's behind it and who's not. Big issue in New York is they're beginning to put a barrier around Lower Manhattan, and they're going to spend, you know, $8 or $10 billion building barriers around Lower Manhattan, designed by Danish architects, and you know, serving lattes on the top of the wall kind of thing. But then if you're out in Red Hook, you're like, well, wait a minute, why are you spending $10 billion for those people in Lower Manhattan? What about me? And why don't I get a wall designed by a Danish architect out here in Red Hook? So there's a lot of social justice issues that are connected with seawalls. And of course, there's these large barriers that a lot of people have built. This is the part of the New Orleans barrier system. They have their own, they can work in certain ways, but they have their own problems. Also, we just learned that the New Orleans barrier, after $14 billion going into the sort of re-engineering of the coastline there, is only good for about another 4 or 5 years of protection. And then they have to re-engineer it and raise it again. So it's a question of what do you build these barriers to, and there's all the ecological hell of them and all that kind of thing. But you know, in some places they're doable. For me, the poster child for dumb big barrier projects was Venice. They have this thing called the Mozi Barrier that they're building in Venice, which the chief engineer of the city called the Ferrari on the seafloor. It's a very highly engineered barrier that is invisible most of the time. It's down below the water, and then when there's a big storm surge or something coming in, Or high tides, they fill it with air and it comes up and it saves the city. They spent $6.5 billion on it. About $1 billion went to ski condos and things for many of the contractors and their girlfriends. A couple hundred guys, I think they were all guys, went to jail. But that was an Italian construction project. What do you expect? But the problem is that they only engineered it for about 8 inches of sea level rise. So basically, it isn't even finished yet, and it's already essentially obsolete. And it's not easy or practically impossible to think about, there I am, okay, I'm back. To think about how to make that work in a world of rising seas. So that's the problem with a lot of these barriers, is what are you engineering it to? And Venice is a great example of that. And then there's the question of, you can raise your house, you can raise your community, you can do whatever you want, but then there's the large infrastructure stuff. The airports, the railroads, the roads, the highways to get to where you are. And for me, that was made very clear when I went to Norfolk Naval Station. Norfolk Naval Station is the biggest naval base in the United States. It's the center for all of our operations in the Atlantic and in the Middle East. 75,000 people work and are stationed there. It's an enormous operation. I went there a number of times. One time I was there with then Secretary of State John Kerry, was standing on the bridge of, Secretary Kerry, of course, gets all this stuff very, very well. I was on the bridge of a battleship with Secretary Kerry when he was talking to the commander of the base, and he asked the commander of the base, how much time does this base have? And the commander of the base said 20 to 40 years. And that is like tomorrow in military planning terms. And it was one of the most mind-blowing things that anyone said to me, or I reported on when I was working on this book. Because that means within 20 years or so, the base has to either move or something has to happen for this base to continue to be functional. And in that whole Hampton Roads area, there's a whole bunch of bases. I think there's 20 bases, and most of them face a similar situation. But here's the deal. The thing that showed me, and is the lesson for communities and things, is that the Navy can afford to do anything, right? I mean, they have all the money they need. If they want to pave the streets in gold and elevate them 14 feet and put in all new piers and wharfs and all that, they can do that, right? That is not a problem. The problem is, what good is doing all that if nobody who works at the base can afford to live in the area because it's all flooded out? If you can't get to the base because all the roads are flooded, if the railroad that brings the munitions and the supplies to the base is underwater half the time. So the Navy has figured out that in order to save the base, they have to save the entire region of Virginia, which is a whole other issue for many, many reasons, obviously. Cost, and also the fact that the military is prohibited from getting involved in civil affairs outside the boundaries of the base. And so it's pretty obvious that this base is going to get moved probably in a piecemeal way. But it really illustrates the problem. It's not just about taking care of yourself and your house. It's about the entire community around you and how you deal with that. So last thing I want to say is one of the things that I learned in this is this idea that opportunity sometimes becomes disguised as catastrophe. That is to say, I met a lot of people who have really cool ideas about how we're going to live with water and in this world of changing water levels and things. There's a lot of really smart architects, urban planners who are thinking about this. I have no doubt that we're going to build a lot of really great 21st century Venices. There's no question about that. I saw that in simple things like this floating structure that was in the slums of Lagos, built by a Dutch Nigerian architect, just with some 55-gallon drums and stuff. It's a community center school, double level. It was an incredibly cool structure. Everybody loved it. It was just, to me, a great triumph of sort of simple floating engineering. Unfortunately, it was too simple and it blew down in a big storm. But they're rebuilding it now in a more sturdier way. And nobody was hurt or anything, in a sturdier way. But it's just an example of sort of a new community space that evolved because he thought differently about the relationship with water in the community. At the other end of that, this is a recent This is an actual floating home in Miami that is, you can tow around with your boat, and it's the sort of high-end version of the Lego stick houses, or in Miami, I don't know if any of you know, there's these platform houses out called Stiltsville out there. But it's just a great example. I think it's like $5 or $6 million, but it's a great example of, floating houses don't have to be like, houseboats. They can be very elegant and beautiful, and there's all kinds of ways of thinking about that. This is a design by a friend of mine, an architect named Ronaldo Borges, who has this notion of these sort of platform cities, floating cities, using a lot of the technology of oil platforms, drilling platforms and things to build essentially elevated cities out in the water. And you can imagine that that would be a wonderful place. There's no reason why that wouldn't be a wonderful place, right? If you could get out there easily, if there were water taxis and things, that is a very cool way to imagine, the future. There's the idea of what New York City now is doing. Instead of building a wall around Lower Manhattan, they're now going to be filling in a lot of Lower Manhattan, and they're going to build it higher and then develop on that fill, so that they're basically building a wall that has, that they can finance essentially by building structures, condos, and things on it, which is, of course, what a lot of Lower Manhattan had been doing for hundreds of years. Of course, lots of cities do this. Singapore, I was just in Singapore, much of it is built on fill. Hong Kong, built on fill. Miami, built on fill. San Francisco, a lot of it is built on fill. So I think this idea of building on fill and extending the cities, except making them higher, is really a direction that the future is going. This is in the Maldives. They're just building new islands, just making a new island, making it higher. And that's happening in a lot of the South Pacific. I think the Chinese are very interested in doing this. And I think that there's no reason why that won't work, and we'll see, in fact, new real estate rising. So the problem, though, is not thinking about how the new stuff will be built. The problem is thinking about what will happen sort of with the old stuff, and what happens to places that we love, that we care about, where we have a lot of built infrastructure now that we don't want to lose, and how do we protect it, or do we not protect it, or what do we do? So that is the sort of rub in thinking about this sort of watery future that we're facing. So I just want to wrap up with what to me are the big questions that all this raises. I'll just mention very quickly. The first is, are we going to get serious about cutting carbon? I mean, we have no indication that we're going to. We've known about the implications of climate change since Jim Hanson's paper, the famous climate scientist in the early 80s. Levels of CO2 in the atmosphere have just continued to go up, 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 up. There's no sign. In fact, it's going up faster. For all the talk about green energy and Teslas and all that, we are doing nothing, literally nothing, worse than nothing, to solve this problem. And until we do that, we're just going to have accelerated rising of seas, accelerated heat waves, accelerated all these impacts that we're talking about. So the number one thing in any conversation about this is that. When does the real estate market collide with climate science? When do people start to think, oh, well, I'm not sure I want to keep this place because I think that I heard this guy named Jeff talk, and maybe he knows what he's talking about or something, and what are we doing about this, and do I want to hold on to this? And people start getting educated about climate science and things, and they start to change their ideas about where they want to own property and things. And I think once that begins to happen, not just with sea level rise, but also with heat and wildfires and things like that, that is going to have a big impact in our world. Where's the money for adaptation going to come from? So it's easy to think about where the money for solar panels are going to come from. Developers, if you can be a scientist or an entrepreneur, and you can develop a solar panel for half the price to somebody else, you're going to make bazillions of dollars, and there's lots of reasons why you're going to get startup funding and all that kind of thing. If you're a person who's thinking about coastal adaptation, you're not going to invent a cool seawall that's going to work everywhere all at once. The questions about adaptation are very complicated. very local. They're not one size fits all. The federal government, of course, right now, our federal government is not interested in funding something like this. But even in the best case scenario, the amount of money that we're talking about here is so enormous that the federal government is not going to come close to dealing with this, right? So this is going to have to come out of private capital somehow. But what the streams of revenue for that private capital into adaptation are, I don't know, and I would love to hear any ideas that people have. But that's going to be a very big question. How quickly are we going to stop building walls and learn to live with water? I think that is the big design lesson that people are figuring out now. The Dutch have decided they're not building any more levees, they're not building that, they're basically going to what they call live with water. That's where all of the smart design stuff that I know about is going. Not building walls, living with water. And I think that that is really the sort of future in thinking about design. And the last thing is, who decides what and who will be saved? I think that we're at, for coastal communities like Nantucket, I think we're at a kind of triage moment of like, we can't save everything. What do we want to save? Who's going to decide that? What buildings, what places, how much do we want to invest in certain things? That's where we are. And I think those are really, really hard questions for preservationists, for anyone historically minded, for all of us who care about coastal places, is that, realizing that, some things are going to be lost, and what those things are and how much we want to invest in protecting what we have and how much we want to just let go, I think is one of the central and hardest questions that we're going to be facing in the coming years as a result of this. So anyway, I just want to wrap up with my last final thing, which I always like to end it with, which is my daughter. This is Grace, who is 14 years old. And when I was wrapping up this book, I talked to this one scientist who said, Jeff, one thing you need to really remember when you think about this is never fight a war with water, because water always wins. And I was like, oh, she said, go look at the Grand Canyon and you will see. So my daughter and I took a trip to the Grand Canyon, and for sure, water kind of won that war. It cut a big canyon there. And for me, this photo symbolizes a lot of things, the power of water, who we're fighting for, why this matters. So I'd like to end with that. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Before a short Q&A, a couple of housekeeping things. One is that there are books for sale, and I would suggest if you want to purchase one and have Jeff sign it, you might do so now. And then also, there's a visual preference survey that was passed out as you entered, and we hope you will complete this. There are students from Preservation Institute Nantucket who are poised to gather them, and this will be important information to help inform our workshop over the next 2 days. So, do I have any questions for, yes?
Sure. MIT's next to last magazine issue was devoted to climate change. Maybe you've seen it. The most amazing thing was right at the opening, a map of the world where we could be and where we, where we will be and where we could be. It's much, much worse. But the interesting thing to me was the northern part of our planet was far hotter. Russia, Canada, China, most of China were virtually unlivable. Also some inland areas of Africa, Saudi Arabia, probably intolerable completely by 2000 or 2050, I think they said. Sorry, 2050. Since so much of the problem is coming from Antarctica, I'm surprised why is more heating on the northern part?
Well, so the unlivable part, I didn't see that MIT study, but I think that unlivable part, the idea of that is because of the extreme heat up there, right? Because the heat waves are going to get hotter and hotter. But the basic idea of Arctic amplification comes from the notion that it's the amount of ice that has been up there. The ice is reflective, right? And so as sunlight hits the ice, it reflects a lot of the heat away, the light away. And as the ice melts, especially the sea ice and the ice around Greenland, it stops reflecting and it opens up to the dark ocean. The ocean then absorbs heat, radiates it back, and it creates a kind of feedback loop of heat in the north. And so it's basically about that. It's about the changing reflectivity of the whole Arctic region. And there's some issues with ocean circulation currents and atmospheric currents, but it's basically about that.
So Antarctica would have more albedo effect, they used to call it?
Well, Antarctica is an entirely different sort of kettle of fish, shall we say. First of all, there is not all of the sort of sea ice down there, so there's not a big change in the albedo effect down there in the same way that there is in the Arctic. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of surface melting down there. There's not a lot of sea ice melting. This issue of this ice cliff collapse is what they're concerned about, but it's not really changing the albedo down there yet.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions?
Bring in the microphone, please. Excuse me, bring in the microphone, please.
The other one? You want that?
Both together to get a signal from the camera.
You get both microphones. You're gonna double fist it. Yeah.
Do both? Okay.
Hang on.
One could interpret your talk as being somewhat pessimistic. I see you've also written and studied the whole idea of engineering the climate. So what's your sense of whether, by virtue of not being up to deal with greenhouse gases and so on, and global warming taking off, what's your sense of that the world will ultimately resort to trying to engineer the climate, and what are the options?
That's a great question. It's interesting how much that comes up. So just to explain, he's asking about geoengineering, which is loosely defined as large-scale manipulation of the Earth's climate. I wrote a book, my previous book was about that. It was at the time a very kind of unknown idea that not only a few scientists were advocating. Now it's basically comes up in every conversation I have. IPCC is writing about it and all that. There's lots of ways of doing it, but the way that is most central to this conversation is the notion of putting particles in the atmosphere, high up in the stratosphere, that would reflect away a tiny amount of sunlight. You only have to reflect away about 2% of the sunlight to offset a doubling of CO2. So there's a lot of people who think that this might be, some people think it's a solution. It is not. Some people think that it could help buy time to reduce emissions. It's a long story, and if anybody's really interested, I encourage them to read that earlier book. There's a lot of problems with it. It's not a magic bullet. It causes problems with ocean acidification. There's all kinds of reasons to think it'll go horribly wrong for all kinds of reasons. Raises the question of who's in control of the thermostat. Is it some 10 guys who have a couple $1 billion who want, it's not very expensive to do this, who want to fly some high altitude airplanes and start doing this. All these almost like nuclear war kind of questions about a lone actor and what a big impact they could have on us. But I want to say two things. One is that I do think it's inevitable, for better or for worse. I don't advocate it, but I do think it's inevitable. So I do think that smart research towards this is good, because we'll learn more about the trade-offs of this. Second thing is it's not going to save us from sea level rise, because it's not going to, as I mentioned, we already have so much heat built up in the oceans and things like that, that even if we do a little bit of cooling with this, we're still going to have huge amounts of ice melt as a result of this. So it can have effects on temperature and things like that, heat waves, that kind of thing, but it is not going to save us from sea level rise. As far as I know, I've been thinking about this for a very long time, there are no magic bullets for sea level rise. There is nothing that is going to stop this. There is no invention of a wall that everyone's going to put in Antarctica. This is going to play out in a very real and very messy way.
One more? Yeah.
I don't know, it works.
Both of them.
If you were going to be alive in 300 to 500 years, where would I find you?
Very good question. I don't know. it's going to, I can't imagine what our planet's going to look like in 250 years. You know, I'm a technological optimist. I grew up in Silicon Valley. I'm a big believer in ingenuity and creativity. But I was the famous phrase, I hesitate to make predictions, especially about the future, you know. So I have no idea. But I do want to end with the last, this is the last question. I promised to say something about hope. And I do have hope. But I don't have, to me, there's sort of two kinds of hope. One is the kind of hope that I had when I was a little kid, waiting for Santa Claus to bring me a new bike, and thinking, oh God, I hope Santa brings me the new bike. And the other kind of hope that I had when I got a hammer and nail and lumber and decided to build a treehouse. So I don't have hope that Santa is going to bring me a new bike for climate change and he's going to fix everything. But I do have hope that if we understand what the risks are, if we think really about what is happening to our world, if we make practical, pragmatic decisions about this, if we have these kinds of conversations, that we can do the equivalent of building a treehouse, and that we can figure out ways to deal with all this. They'll be painful, we'll have to let a lot of stuff go, but there'll also be a lot of great new things. And so, to the degree that I have hope, it's the hope that we'll build a treehouse together on this.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for an amazing talk. So again, there will be books on sale, and Jeff will be signing The Water Will Come. And again, thank you for helping kick off what we think is going to be a really significant workshop. I will say one thing. I've been asked, because now I've been involved in a number of Keeping History Above Waters, and you'll see the work that we're doing here on Nantucket in terms of sea rise visualizations. What does historic preservation have to do with all this? And I think many people believe historic preservation is about freezing things in time and managing change in historic district, which is true, but it really is about managing change and managing it sensitively. So I think who better to be involved and at the forefront of this issue than those of us who think in long periods of time, right? And who work very closely with communities and stakeholders and help identify values and help manage change and hopefully be creative and build tree houses too, apparently. So thank you again, Jeff.
Thanks, Marty.
Yeah, shingle tree houses, right.